across various sectors, but especially more recently, education. So many governments have announced to be integrating AI into school curriculum. And with that, there are also new issues around online safety that we are seeing an increase of. For, I guess, background, we have the AI Asia Pacific Institute that is hosting this conversation, has done in the past great work with NetSafe, covering issues on the rise of the intersection of AI and online safety. Those issues that were introduced to us with the rise of the internet, such as misinformation, which are now being aggravated with the rise of AI. We are also about to embark on the journey collaborating with Access Partnership, which joins us here today, covering particularly what we are seeing globally on the landscape of governments issuing regulations to protect children, particularly, but also how does that influence how education and the future takes place across those issues. So we will walk through each panelist one by one here, but let's start with thinking about, can you give us some introduction to the work that you do, starting with you, Libby, and what are you seeing globally when it comes to safety, the rise of particular issues, and also regulations?
Namaste. Is this on? Kia ora koutou from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's really, really lovely. It's not, you probably can't hear it now. It's wonderful to be here with you to talk about this really, really important. Now? That's better. Thank you. Kia ora. So thank you very much for having me, and as Kelly said, this is rapidly developing issues here. So NetSafe started 20 years ago when internet was being increasingly used in schools and children need to be kept safe. We started with a product called Hector's World, where this little dolphin appeared on your computer screen to give you a little bit of a warning when you might what to do if you maybe stumbled across something that you shouldn't. Of course, things have grown really rapidly since then, and now exacerbated at such a speed with AI, misinformation, and so on. And so our approach really is about practical ways to keep people safe, to keep children, their families safe, and to work with all stakeholders. There's no simple fix here. There are, of course, rapidly developing conversations about increased regulation, from some regulation to outright bans. So I think we'll pick up those discussions a bit as we go, but thank you.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Abhinit. I'm a Vice President with Access Partnership. I lead a lot of our work globally on AI. And as the generation which is obviously responsible for developing AI and deploying AI, we obviously have to look at both the sides, the opportunity and how do we harness that, looking at the scaling aspect, the adoption aspect, but also mitigating the harms, right? And the question about AI is not that how AI is in children's life, is how it's structuring their childhood. That's a big change. We didn't have digital technology when we were kids, but now you are not only talking about where is their content stored, it's also about what content are they seeing, what content are they sharing, what content are they creating with AI and so on, right? So what we are seeing globally in terms of regulation, we're seeing a clear shift from voluntary child safety commitments. There were countries which said, have some commitments. UN had some commitments. Everybody talked about like we need to have some child safety commitments to something which is more binding obligation, enforceable duties of care for everybody from platforms all the way from a shared responsibility perspective. We are seeing a lot of convergence on the same pillars, right-based foundations, safety by design, for example. And as Libby said, we are seeing those two extremes. You have on one hand more age-based restrictions. You have heard a lot about some of these things. Obviously, there are challenges, pros and cons of all those approaches. But on the other side, we are also seeing a lot of system-wide controls, which is minor modes, content classification. And we'll go through the session as we go through. So there's obviously a wide variety of how companies and countries are trying to treat with this solution.
Yeah, thanks.
This works? Yeah. Thank you, Kelly. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nikhila Natarajan. I go by Nikki among my friends and colleagues. I'm a youth and media researcher That's a fancy way of saying I hang out with kids and teens and I ask them these questions that we're bringing to this conversation. And I tell those stories through their voices. That's the work that I do. And my entry point into this conversation today with all of you would be from the vantage point of the pillars of this conference itself: people, planet, progress. Out of that, I'll choose two. People. Who are we talking about? We're talking about people we love: sisters, brothers, daughters, sons, grandchildren. These are very special people, right? And when we think about progress, we think about progress in the context of these children and teens. We're thinking basically about how do we create the conditions within our homes, within our families, within the larger technological environment to keep them happy for their well-being so that they thrive and they have the best shot at a future that is bright and good for them. And with that, I will start with some provocations for this room. First, and the most important, youth voices and youth perspectives and their experiences must be centered in any conversation about technology policy. They have to be at the table. Second, and connected to that, is that if we take a developmental lens to this problem, not come to it from the point of view of the technology, take a developmental lens. How do they grow? How do they develop? What are the characteristics of teens that we must pay special attention to? What is it that makes media use and technology use really challenging for them? Where is the opportunity? Then we can reorient this conversation in a powerful way, because institutions are usually slow to respond, and it's like a bicycle chasing a race car. So that's the second thing. And the final thing, I think, is India, in the last few weeks alone, has given us a powerful and timely example of what common sense regulation could look like. You'll all remember January 3rd, that week, the grok issue with the obscenity with the women's pictures, and how India responded, especially Meghti. And that response is essentially rooted in our culture. We can do this. It can be that simple. It can work. And there is broad public agreement here in India for that move. So I think just one last thing, because before I hand it over to you, Alexandra. While I was on this flight, long flight from New York to here, right? 8 hours plus 8 hours. So there's a bunch of youngsters next to me in the middle aisle with the 4 seats. So we were passing notes to each other, and I was asking them, India has done this. What do you think? You know what they told me? They said, this should be an international standard. And they were from everywhere. They were from France, actually. They were going to Singapore, and on the way they were going to Rajasthan. And these guys, they told me, all 3 boys, they said, this should be an international standard. It's a great idea.
Thank you so much. So I'm Aleksandra Chmielewska, and I work for GIGA, which is a joint initiative between International Telecommunications Union and UNICEF. And our goal is to connect every school in the world to the internet. So, before we even start discussions about AI, we also try to make sure that we bridge the digital divide at the very basics, right? So we still have more than 30% of population that doesn't have access to the internet. So we have to also consider this when we are discussing about AI and equal access to AI. But my perspective to this panel will be, twofold. First, sharing what UNICEF and other European countries mostly have been doing to make sure that young voices are included, and I'm glad that you've mentioned that, and there have been a lot of developments on that matter since December last year. But also, I'm here, I guess, the youngest panelist, so we haven't really discussed the age though, but it seems to me. So I'm also wearing a hat of a person that's, I can call myself a generation social media, Facebook generation. I grew up basically when those platforms were created and developed, and so I witnessed firsthand how it really impacted the relations, our brains, our self-development, without those platforms being regulated, right? We had evidence, a lot of evidence about harm that those platforms are posing, and there has been research then leaked by internal research done by Meta that was saying that 1 out of 3 girls that is interacting with Instagram is thinking badly about their own bodies. So now we have AI that is being embedded in those platforms, and I'm just glad to see that we finally start to discuss how to regulate this, but I believe the majority of us, unfortunately, have already suffered some consequences. So that will be the perspective that I will
Great,
share.
so we have a lot of great things to start with. Not enough time, unfortunately. I'd like to stay with you, Alexandra, because I think a lot of great things were mentioned, including Dr. Nick talking about the approach of India. We're also going to talk about Australia as well, but I know you're based in Spain, and Spain has also introduced some new ways of thinking about this. I think research now tells us, and we have had many incidents, particularly in the last year or so, of teenagers and children and the real harm that some of these tools can take a toll on people. And also we are faced with this question, where does accountability lies, right? Does it lie with the organization, the social media companies? What exactly does the government need to do? And is that approach working, right? Is regulation the way forward? So what is your perspective on that, and particularly from what you're seeing on the ground?
Of course, thank you for this question. Spain, among the European Union countries, has been really at the forefront of proposing progressive laws to protect children from the harm that is being created by the platforms. It followed the example of Australia, all right, that is really a front runner when it comes to banning access to social media and setting the threshold at the age of 16. So Spain is currently proposing the same thing, and is leading a coalition of 6 other European countries that are not only suggesting a threshold, but also proposing to ban such harmful social media features as infinite scrolling, that I think we've all been suffering victims to that. I do believe regulations is important, and unfortunately we can see for the moment that the system really puts the burden on parents to police the access, on kids to self-regulate, on educators to manage access to the platforms. And of course, it takes a village to raise a kid, but the village also needs to have resources, right? So really need to make sure that we have laws in place, and not only in place, but that they are enforced. So EU AI Act, just very briefly, I don't want to steal more of the time, but EU AI Act is really a groundbreaking proposal that was enforced in February last year, but we still have to see what will be the results of those regulations. So it's very early. But as a society overall, we need to just argue towards the governments to make sure that platforms are being accountable, and that we shift the burden from the village to the companies.
Great. So let's now think about, guys, building on that context. We know that SAFE is based in New Zealand, and it's also, which is a country also observing the steps of other countries, right? Including the very close neighbor, Australia. Can you speak to that, Libby, and what you think that approach means?
Certainly I can. Thank you very much. And I'd really like to just tap into what everybody has talked about here, is that we're really talking about humans here. We're talking about the effects on people, and understanding who we are in this place. So in terms of New Zealanders watching very closely the Australian developments and the trend in Europe as well, there is a bill before the New Zealand Parliament to ban social media for under 16s. NetSafe actually is opposed to that idea. We actually think that it's a lot more complex than that. And accountability is a shared thing, and that it's not likely to improve safety, and it's more likely to make things go to ground, so we'll hide it. We should be cautious perhaps and see what happens in Australia. Well, we already know quite a bit of what is. In fact, a lot of kids are still on their social media. They're not being thrown off by the platforms. So it's very much, as we see, a shared accountability. And this has really got to be about building trust and relationships across the sectors. But we actually think that for a lot of reasons that we should be really cautious about. Regulation may help, some regulation to some level, but when AI is shaping what children are seeing and learning, then there's got to be some increased accountability in the sector, I think.
Anything to add?
Very quickly, something that we need to think about is when we're talking about AI and regulation, I think wholesale we need a new vocabulary to talk about AI, because if you open up your phones or a young person's phone, AI is present there in many forms. So there's an inventory of media that they use which has AI embedded in it, and that's the engine that is behind their feeds, which I've called an ambient AI media environment. So when we're talking about AI, we are essentially saying what? That it's predicting based on your past patterns of behavior, and it's predicting something that is incentivized to make you stay. Or, if it's not social media, it's incentivized to give you instant rewards. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up to this room and asking us all to think about it is that young people, children and teenagers, they're in a place where they're exceptionally fast at learning things, but the way they're developing, they're like a race car where the brakes are still being built. So the onus of decision making is put on the kid, and that's not okay. So the reason I'm saying this is if we start thinking about the stuff like this, then no matter what technology comes next, we have a better toolkit to deal with it. Just some thoughts. Yeah.
I just to add, I love what you said, that because we are all currently struggling seeing deepfakes online and having to decide, is this real or this is not real, and our grandmas get extremely upset when you tell them this is not real, right? So you can imagine the pressure that children currently face, and how do you expect them to be able to process that information in the same way when their brains are still being formed to make those decisions, right? Much about, I think, learning about AI is building the capacity to know when it's lying to you, when it's hallucinating, right? And children are still not properly equipped to deal with that.
Yeah. Could I add? I mean, great points made by the panel. I might disagree with Alex a bit, because I think it's not just the provider's fault, or it's not just fully responsibility of the provider. It's a shared responsibility, but it's not shared equally. Providers obviously have to do a brunt, or they will get a big chunk, because they are deciding what type of recommendation, what type of content is going to the kids, and what type of content they are generating and how it's distributed. But it's obviously responsibility of the parents and educators. And to your point, I think I'm very thankful that at least for kids we have parents and educators who can build resiliency and literacy. For seniors, we don't have any of that. That's a totally entire panel topic, but we'll come to that separately. But it's also the fact that it's not longer a conversation about content takedown or content related issue. It has to be by design, which is where the role of regulator is also important. You can't just have kids locked down and their entire childhood becoming a biometric lockdown where they have to keep proving their age every time they log in, right? I came from my childhood was in an area which is a very militarized zone. I know the PTSD of like seeing you being checked every time. Imagine these guys are online on any platform and they are asking them for, in an ideal world, age verification, but in the real world, they're asking them for digital ID verification, which is a lot more data which is not really required, but that's where, because there's no design, there's no systems to comply, to just look at how do you just check the age. So to me, it's a governance issue. It's obviously an issue which the platforms have to take the brunt of it, but it's also a whole of society issue as well.
So now I want us to, I guess, take all these concepts and ideas and think about that in the context of education, right? Because we know where I'm based, the UAE has been, I believe, the second country to announce that they're introducing AI into school curriculum, right? After the US, I believe. And you have seen a drive from other governments following that approach as well. Of course, we don't want to leave children behind, so they need to learn about AI very quickly. On the other hand, one growing issue that I'm seeing and watching very closely is that you have all major technology companies forming large partnerships with local schools and governments to not only provide the whole technology there, but also shape how education will happen in many ways, right? And we know, well, this is now happening not just inside social media, this will happen inside schools as well. So how do we go about shaping that in a way where we also see how there's almost a point where there's been taking advantage of the fact that governments are almost often slower to introduce safeguards, and they know less about the technology. So technology companies can come in a lot faster and say, here's all we can provide, and let's design the way that this is gonna, what way this is gonna go, right? So shall we start with you, Dr. Nikki? What are your thoughts on that?
So, Kelly, you're basically asking about AI in education, basically AI inside schools, right? Ask the kids. They have amazing stuff to say. They'll say it's cringe, they'll say it's creepy, they'll say it's disgusting. And they're very nuanced when they respond. And since I've been chatting with them and doing surveys, they're really happy to talk about this stuff. And they know where the red lines are. We just have to listen to them. We just have to ask them. Every student that I've spoken to in middle school and high school, and I've spoken to hundreds of them and done a survey statewide in New Jersey, the general red line that the children draw is, look, we don't like this image-based AI stuff. Where it kind of gets into our creative stuff, just stay away, you guys. They don't like it. But Frank, a 16-year-old boy, he's using it for square roots because he's an athlete. He doesn't have much time. He's using it to learn stuff. So I think children are unique and their uses of AI are unique. And they absolutely have the right to know how the incentive structure works and how these companies make money. When they're learning so many other things, right, on these media platforms, certainly this can be taught. Because once they understand how their attention or data is bundled and sold, let me tell you, they'll have surprising insights to offer us on how to regulate it.
I can just add to that. It's amazing that we've been involved in consultations with children, and as I said at the beginning, there has been an increasing effort by international organizations also to include children in the discussions about the use of AI in education. I attended an amazing panel yesterday organized by UNICEF, and there was a young UNICEF ambassador that was presenting UNICEF children and youth statement with 8 very clear asks. One of them is to be part of the conversations. And the consultations, the statement was produced based on consultations with more than 50,000 children from more than 180 countries. So it is happening, right? The involvement of children at the scale, it is happening. What is important in my mind is to keep, to make sure that children are being consulted, but they're not being held accountable. Accountability should still lie within the regulators, and platforms. Yeah.
I think that's an important point, right? It is distributed, yes, but at the end of the day, yes, governments are still tasked with the role of managing policies and regulations, even though it does impose a higher challenge now, because oftentimes you're regulating something that is, fairly new and introduces to us a lot more new challenges that we've experienced in the history of times, right?
Good. Yeah, I think great points again on in school. I think kids know that if they don't have access to AI, they lose out in the market, because we keep saying people with AI won't take your job, people with AI skills will take your job. So kids obviously are mindful of that. They want to learn more AI. However, obviously, as Alex talked about, there is that whole concern. When does it change from just learning to continuous monitoring? How do you, and even at a school level, how does it become something which sort of profiles them, which sort of tracks them, which sort of follows them throughout the years, right? From all the way from grade 1 all the way to till the graduate school, then college. How does it become something which is profiling them, even in their, like, this particular kid is a problem child, for example, right? So all of that stuff, it obviously should not happen, right? So that's how do you have a guardrails around that. And there are 4 things which obviously we talk about in some of the work that we have done. We talk about how there should be strict boundaries on data. What is that data used for? How do you sort of look at that data? Impact assessments before deployment. That is where the school's responsibility is. They need to look at before, and platform as well. How do you deploy some solution so that it doesn't obviously impact the procurement aspect, the governance aspect? How do you keep track of that? And surveillance should be avoided at all costs. So the default should be there, should not be, the AI system should not be used for surveillance in a school environment, in an education environment. Because that's something which is very easy to go down the slippery slope. It's very obvious for schools and education institutions why we need to do that, how should we profile, but that's something which obviously has to be avoided by default.
Oh yes, thank you. There are so many pieces to pick up here. It's hard to know where to start. But for me, in the education space, we need to be bridging the gaps between policy and practice. We need to be having impacts on the ground in communities. And sometimes new policies are reactive, not proactive. It can be really hard to keep up. So in this hyper-connected world full of challenge and change, I think it's really important that, and Abhineet has also picked up on the lifelong learning piece, right? So this isn't just children. People of all age need to have some understanding here. And in terms of shared responsibility, we need to be teaching people some basics. And what I'm working on is the concept of digital global citizenship. And who is that person? Who am I? Am I a school kid? Am I a grandma? Am I a parent? And how do I identify as that sort of digital global citizen? How am I connected to everybody here? And what is my responsibility? So that I can ask big questions like, how do I know what's real? And when I do figure out what's real, what do I do with that information? So that actually everybody does have responsibility as a person. So this is my kind of focus.
Great, and I think just building on that, and something that Alexandria also mentioned, is one of the largest issues that we have with AI is, of course, the digital divide and how it's leaving a lot of people behind as well. And that is almost more serious than oftentimes, right? Because when we think about even more serious than exposing children too much to the risk of AI, it will be the separation from the children that will never have access to that because they don't even have access to the internet right now in a lot of countries or remote parts of the world, right? But I want to ask, I guess, thinking about action and concrete ways that we can shape this conversation. One of the things that came out of the study we did in collaboration with NetSafe was that we thought about what would be the recommended approach going forward. And we came up with 3 steps, right? Is the preparation for, as we know, this is an ongoing process in terms of how technology is changing. Is the code process when we need to think about what are the changes that must happen, and then finally, how do we intervene when things go wrong? So that means in practice, agencies or, now you have cyber agencies. Singapore has also introduced as one of the first countries to do that, right? That you can report real harms, and that is how NetSafe works, right? So where people can go to when you have issues as bullying, cyberbullying, harmful content, subject to being, deep fakes being made out of you that are not real, right? So influence, and these are things that are very, very real, happening in a lot of households right now. So can we go back to each one of you and think about what would you propose that would be tangible steps? What do we need to see? I think Libby, for example, when we talk about regulation, perhaps we're saying perhaps that is not really the right way. How should we be thinking about this?
I think the first thing to do with the regulation is to have a conversation with the public. I think this has become a binary argument, are you for it or against it, when actually it's much more nuanced than that. And most people really are not sure of the ins and outs. They're not sure of why banning might help or might not. So I think it's really important, and we don't just rely on digital tools to find these things out, but actually that we get into communities and have these conversations so that we can actually see what will be effective for our young people, because the whole point is we want to prevent harm and we want to promote positive engagement in the digital world.
For some reason, I'm the only one with a unique mic. But anyway, on the points you highlighted, yeah. Maybe
User can talk longer.
I hope so. So I think there are obviously a few things. One, to me, is I look at it from two perspectives. In the internet age, and this is, I'm talking about pre-social media, I think we had some tools, we had mechanisms to deal with these problems. We have failed this in the age of social media, Web 2.0, and we are obviously failing this in the age of AI. And in my head, the biggest factor is the fact that internet age was a lot more modular, where content takedown was possible because it was a single web page, single website. Today in social media, you have to block a content, you have to work with the company. You cannot do it, in a modular fashion. And AI is the same issue. Unless and until we talk about, we solve the business model problem, I think this is going to be a challenge. We have failed our kids in the age of social media. We'll have the same challenges. I think that's one. Number two, I think on the point from the platform perspective, I think there has to be some sort of a risk steering. Not everything needs to have the highest category of risk. There are, for example, public interactions, there are direct messagings, there are live streamings, which are a higher risk. Maybe you need a lot more preventions there as compared to maybe some normal interactions, like kids talking to each other on social media. What's the harm in that? Let them, people there are studies which say kids also enjoy, they find that as a way to explore the world. And the kids today are a global audience. How many of you here have kids who don't eat food without watching TV or without checking out a game? Right? I mean, unfortunately, only one. I thought it's a very common thing. I see it I'm based in Singapore, so anywhere I go, every kid has a device in front of them, because that's the only way. And you can't expect kids 10 years down the line not play games, not watch YouTube, because that's the experience they're growing up with. So it's our responsibility to make that something safer for them. So let me just stop there, Nikki.
I feel guilty now because I did get my child an Atari for Christmas. Does anyone know what an Atari is?
No more books, right?
That is his first introduction to game, yeah, so.
So, Abhinit, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. So, you heard what he had to say. Now, very interesting lens you can take to this is, during this period between 11 and 25, it's a long period, but that's adolescence now. So, people in that age group are much more tuned to their peers than to adults in their house. It's not like they're not listening to you, it's just their peer orientation is heightened during that time. And we can think about this differently rather than think about why are they on that app or why are they doing that during having dinner. Think about what does it mean, what are the kind of environments we can create which has their peers around them or has those things that they are oriented to at the time when they want it. And we could have a very different scenario. The big idea here that I want to leave with all of you in this room is, let's not foreground the technology or the technological harms. Instead, let's think, how can we build a better conversation with these young people so they sit across the table with us and talk, because you want them to come back to you when there's a problem.
Yeah, so many points to discuss. I do agree that there should be conversations with the society about regulations, and In fact, I was just checking, the stats about the public service about the threshold, 16 age threshold adopted by Australia governments, and apparently there are 70% of citizens that support this, but only 25% believe that it will actually work. So we really have, a problem here, right? So basically, people just no longer believe that regulations can work and can enforce things. You can. There is an example from the European Commission that is being imposing serious fines on Meta for breaking GDPR rules, and most of them, I think it was 2.7 billion euros that Meta has to pay for breaking GDPR regulations, and half of this is related to child protection policy. But in the end, the companies are doing cost-benefit analysis, and it's still profitable, right? So we are not talking about AI for humanity, we're still talking about AI for profits. So I think my point here is we definitely need to make sure that there are more teeth in the regulations that we impose. And yes, I do agree with you. The last points, I think that technology also reveals several gaps in the other systems that we are having. And a lot of kids are consulting, ChatGPT to discuss questions about mental health, right? So the problem is not on the side of technology. The problem is on the society and how social services.
Yes. So we still have about 5 or 10 minutes left. I want to give some time for questions. Do we have any of the facilitators? Do we have a microphone? No? I'll just walk to you.
Thank you. Great session, very good points that you guys discussed. My question is that do you think a good solution would be appointing a local liaison for every district, especially for a country like India, where internet is free but education is expensive? So not every child has access to education, or not every child has a parent who is educated. So appointing a local liaison for every district who educates and goes to every house and makes sure that especially the kids who don't have access to such things but are using internet, are using AI, are educated in this way, or are made aware of the consequences this way.
Thank you for the question. Your name? Ankita. Thank you, Ankita. What I do know, and what is being discussed in some other rooms here, so I'll bring it to you. I believe that last 500 million in India who still are off the grid in a sense, that's really the focus of the India AI mission now, and they're hoping to bring voice-enabled facilities to that population so that they can access these services on voice without even having to type it out. So I think absolutely yes. Yeah.
Is that okay? Yeah, cool. I'm actually from Australia, so I love that everyone was talking about what we're doing in Australia. But what I was actually going to, maybe a comment, maybe a question, is, when you're talking about the desire for, high support but probably not effective, or, that you were saying before that maybe there's not as much impact being had on the platform. What I would probably just say is, from a comment point of view, is that we have to remember that big tech has massive resources to muddy the water in terms of the conversation. So when this was happening inside Australia, you would find a lot of people were in ardent support of the programs, but it became a very convoluted situation because the means of getting knowledge and understanding were actually impacted on. So the knowledge for people to fight back was actually problematic. But yeah, I think that was a thing in terms of what I see for you guys going through in New Zealand, in Spain. There is just a lot of complexity there with how that happens with big tech owning the means of distribution of knowledge.
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting to get your comments there too. I mean, obviously, there's a couple of things there. We've got a lot to learn. Let's see what happens, right? And also, we know in terms of the interaction with other people, you've got got kids in Australia who are 200 kilometres from anybody. So the need for that sort of social connection is really, really important. I think just something too, I'm thinking in this kind of education space is that, and I know this is a pattern around in many countries of like getting back to the basics in education of, reading and writing and having, STEM and everything becoming more and more modular. When we're not in the industrialized world anymore, we're in the globalized, network, chaotic world, so we need to get better at the complex, and this is what we need to be focused on.
Okay, we have time for one last question, short.
Hello, panel. I am really loving this session. And Alexandra, you mentioned that many students these days, they use ChatGPT for their academic work. I myself am in high school, and I look at my peers and Perplexity, Gemini, ChatGPT. It's like there are academic integrity rules, because in the International Baccalaureate, there is a whole section on academic integrity, but you can still not limit people using AI. You can make them use that as a guiding hand, but awareness, like aside from awareness, how do you exactly think that can be answered to? How will we be made to know what are the consequences unless we actually have that conversation? I think Nikki ma'am also mentioned that, so yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, well, I'm also using ChatGPT for the record. Raise your hand, who doesn't? I'm very curious. I was actually not arguing against the use of AI and those platforms in education. That would be unrealistic, right? So the question is not whether we use them, whether we embrace them, but the question is how. And I do agree with you that, we have to just put an effort into educating children and also teachers on, biases, hallucinations that those platforms can have, and also learn a bit more about critical thinking and answers they're giving us. And I think, some companies are already creating versions for young students, like education platforms where the chat doesn't necessarily give you directly the answers, but tries to enter with you into discussion and actually push you into, critical thinking. So this is a positive step, but it is here to stay. And even organizations like UNICEF, UNESCO are investing a lot in making sure the children and educators are well trained and know how to use them effectively. We all use them.
I'll just add to what Alexandra said. Tiny little story, if Kelly will allow me. So back in 1950, Alan Turing, he came up with a question: can computers think, right? Which is that famous paper which launched the AI field. But within a short while, he changed that question to: can a computer effectively deceive a person into thinking that this is a human, right? The short point here is, let us never forget that this began as a game of subtle deception. It was never meant to be overt, right? And if we can call out subtle forms of deception as deception, then we have a better starting point.
Excellent. So we have about 4 minutes to go. I can see people coming into the room. Less than 1 minute, what are the closing remarks? What are we taking away with us here? So from my perspective is the most important thing is for us to educate ourselves, and I precisely think it's conversations like this that really help us to do that. So I'm very grateful to this incredible panel here today. Thank you all for joining us. And let me pass to Libby first.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, everybody. And I couldn't agree more. It's about educating ourselves and each other. It's about stepping up to the world with confidence, courage, and a sense of shared responsibility.
Yep. I have a mic. And I must compliment the fact that in the world of everything fake, we have real flowers in front of us. But the answer to that point, I would say, in a world where we are sort of living the fact that there have been a lot of effort by parents, a lot of responsibility on parents and educators fighting upstream against all the harms. Like 72%, I just read a study, I don't know how true it is, but 72% of teenagers in the US have intimate conversations with chatbots. Massive issues, right? And we are just focusing on parents and educators fighting against this thing, rather than looking at can we look at the business model? Can we look at this thing from a design perspective? Which is where some of the countries are taking steps. It's not a yes to technology versus no to technology. It's about how do we get a safe environment to everybody. So that's what I'll maybe end up with.
Thank you. Youth agency comes from a very difficult juncture in development. Recognizing it is central to us having better conversations.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're at the inception point. We're really seeing lots of, rules, regulations, and activities by the countries, international organizations happening. So that's definitely very positive. Only 22 years after Facebook was created, but still, that's there is a progress. But I wanted to end on a positive note. So just flagging all those positive things that are happening. We really need to look at Australia as a test bed if it works, and ultimately just make sure that technology does not extract the value from children, but empowers them. And I think this is something that we're just starting to observe.
And on that note, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining.